Morning I built everything was a Thursday in April 1987. I remember because I had exactly $4,200 in a savings account at TD Bank, a second-hand pickup truck, and a handshake agreement with a contractor in Mississauga who needed someone reliable to handle his landscaping overflow. I was half 31 years old, and I told my wife we were going to be okay. She didn't entirely believe me. 37 years later, when I was sitting on the back deck of our property in Burlington, Ontario, watching the sun come up over Lake Ontario with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, I was running a landscaping and property services company with 43 full-time employees, contracts across the GTA, and a reputation I had bled for. I had more than okay. I also had a son-in-law who, the night before my daughter's wedding anniversary party, the party I was throwing, the party I was paying for, I overheard saying to his friend on the phone, "The old man's losing his grip. Another year, maybe two, and everything flows to Diane. I just have to keep smiling until then." I stood there in the hallway of my own house, 63 years old, holding a glass of scotch I'd been bringing back to my wife, and I didn't move for a long time. Let me back up. My daughter Diane is my only child. Her mother, my wife Paulette, passed 8 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, very fast, very cruel. After that, it was just the two of us for a while. Diane had just finished her degree at McMaster, was working at an accounting firm in Hamilton. We ate a lot of dinners together that first year. We talked a lot. I thought I knew her. I thought I knew who she was. She met Owen at a work conference in Toronto. He was charming in that particular way that I've learned to be suspicious of, the kind of charming that feels like a performance, where the smile arrives a half second too late, just a beat behind the eyes. But Diane loved him, and she was happy. And after losing her mother, I was not going to be the one to dim that. So I welcomed him. I learned his coffee order. I brought him into the business conversations because he asked questions, and I thought it meant he was curious. I thought it meant he respected what I'd built. They got married 4 years ago, small ceremony in Niagara-on-the-Lake. I walked my daughter down the aisle and I cried. I'm not ashamed of that. Paulette should have been there. That's all I'll say about that day. After the wedding, Owen started coming around more. Not to visit, to observe. That's the word I use now, looking back. He'd ask about the company books, about the property portfolio I'd quietly assembled over the decades, about my retirement timeline. I answered him honestly because I thought that's what family did. He once asked me directly what I planned to do with the business when I stepped back. I told him I hadn't decided. He nodded slowly, like he was filing that away. The anniversary party was supposed to be a celebration. 4 years of marriage, family and close friends, catered dinner in the backyard, string lights. I'd hired a company from Oakville because I wanted someone else to do work for once. I'd been feeling the age in my knees that summer. 63 doesn't feel old until it suddenly does. It was the night before the party. I'd gone inside to get Paulette's sister, my sister-in-law Fran, another drink. Owen was somewhere in the house. I assumed he was in the guest room. Instead, he was in the sunroom at the back, door half open, talking quietly on his phone. I heard my name. Eyes stopped walking. No, he still thinks I'm interested in learning the business. I've been doing this for 4 years, it's not that much longer. A pause. Then, the old man's losing his grip. Another year, maybe 2, and everything flows to Diane. I just have to keep smiling until then. Another pause. He laughed quietly. A private, satisfied laugh. She doesn't see it either. She just thinks her dad likes having us around. I walked back to the kitchen. I set down both glasses. I stood at the sink and looked at the backyard. The lights I'd spent 2 hours stringing up that afternoon. The table set with the rented linens. The garden Paulette had designed and I'd maintained for 20 years. I didn't feel rage. I want to say that clearly because people assume a moment like that must feel like fire. It didn't. It felt like ice. Very clear, very quiet. The kind of cold that tells you the temperature has dropped past a certain point and now the rules of things have changed. I went back out to the deck and handed Fran her drink and sat down beside her and said absolutely nothing about what I'd heard. The party the next day was lovely. Owen was charming. He helped carry chairs and told stories and shook hands with all the right people. I watched him the way you watch something you finally understood. Not with hatred, with clarity. The week after, I called my lawyer. I want to explain something here, because I think people misunderstand what a moment like this makes you want to do. The easy thing, the satisfying in the moment thing, would have been to confront him, throw him out, rewrite the will that night in a fury. But I am 63 years old. I have been in business for 37 years. I've survived 2 recessions, a flood that took out our main equipment depot, a lawsuit from a former foreman, and the death of my wife. I did not build what I built by reacting. I built it by thinking ahead. So I thought ahead. My will at that time left the business and the bulk of the estate to Diane. She was my daughter, and I trusted her. But the problem I had perhaps been too comfortable ignoring was that Diane and Owen's finances were entirely merged. What went to her in practical terms went to them. And the man in my sunroom had made clear that this was not an accident. This was a plan. A patient 4-year plan. I met with my lawyer Ted at his office on James Street in Hamilton. I told him what I'd heard. He asked if I was certain. I told him I was. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Okay, let's talk about what we can do." What we could do turned out to be quite a lot. The business. Palmer Property Services. Yes, my name built with my hands. I began the process of restructuring into a trust. The terms of the trust meant that Diane could benefit from its profits as a beneficiary, but ownership and operational control would pass to a board that included Ted, my accountant Brenda, and a former operations manager I trusted completely. No individual, including any spouse, could simply inherit it or liquidate it. It would run or it would be wound down on the board's terms, not anyone else's. The investment properties. I had 6 at that point, across Burlington and Hamilton. I began quietly transferring 2 of them into a separate holding structure that Diane could access only under specific conditions, none of which involved her marital status. This took about 4 months to arrange properly. I was careful, I didn't rush. Owen was still coming to Sunday dinners and asking his questions and smiling his smile. And I was answering him cordially and telling him very little of substance, which I realized was no different from what I'd always been doing. Except now I knew why it mattered. There was one dinner, mid-October, where he asked me directly about my succession timeline. When did I think I'd step back from day-to-day operations? Had I thought about who would take over? I said I was still figuring it out. He said, "You should really have a plan, Dad." He called me Dad. He had always called me Dad. I said I probably should, and I smiled at him. And I passed him the bread. What I hadn't yet done, what I kept putting off, was talk to Diane. This is the part I find hardest to explain. Because Diane is my daughter. She lost her mother. She had built a life with this man. And what I had was one overheard phone call and 4 years of hindsight. I didn't have anything she could hold in her hands and look at. I had a feeling and a half-heard plan, and the particular instinct that comes from spending a lifetime reading people in business situations. What if she didn't believe me? Worse, what if she believed me and it destroyed her? What if I was wrong? I thought about this for months. I talked to Ted about it. I talked to Fran about it. Paulette's sister, who I trust completely and who has known Diane since she was born. Fran was quiet for a long time when I told her. Then she said, "I've never fully trusted him either. There's something in the eyes." She paused. "But you have to be careful how you bring this to Diane. She won't thank you for it if it feels like an ambush." So I waited. And I watched. The thing that ultimately gave me what I needed wasn't another overheard conversation. It was a phone call from my accountant, Brenda, in January. She had been reviewing some documentation for the trust restructuring and noticed that someone had accessed a shared folder on the company's cloud system. A folder that contained draft financial projections and property appraisals that had no business being looked at by anyone outside the company. The access log showed a device that wasn't mine, wasn't any employee's. It was a personal device, registered to an account under Owen's name. He had been going through my financial records. I had that printed and signed by Brenda and added to a file I had been keeping. Then, I went to see Diane. I asked her to come for lunch, just the 2 of us, at a restaurant in Burlington we'd been going to since she was a teenager. I didn't tell her what it was about. She came in cheerful, ordered the soup she always asked about my knees. I waited until the food came. Then I put the folder on the table. I told her everything. The phone call, the trust restructuring, the file access. I spoke slowly and I didn't editorialize. I just laid it out in order. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "How long have you known?" I told her. 7 months. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I said I needed to be sure. I said I also needed to make sure there was nothing she could lose that she couldn't recover from. That by the time I came to her, I wanted to come with something more than suspicion. She looked down at her soup. She said very quietly, I knew something was off. I didn't want to know what it was. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers, and that's when she started crying. Not loud. She's always been like her mother that way. Quiet with the hard things. We sat there for a long time. What happened after that is mostly Diane's story, not mine. So I'll say only this. She had a conversation with Owen that I was not present for. She told me later it lasted about 40 minutes and that he did not deny anything, which she said was almost worse than if he had. He had the look, she said, of someone whose gamble had simply not come in. Annoyed, not remorseful. She said he asked her twice whether I had already changed the will. They separated in March. The divorce was finalized in November. It was not easy and it was not clean, but she had a good lawyer and she came through it. I want to be honest about what I felt when it was over. People expect me to say I felt vindicated. I didn't, not exactly. I felt tired. I felt sad for my daughter in a way I hadn't felt since the funeral. I felt something that I can only describe as grief. Not for Owen, not for what he'd done, but for the version of events where none of this had happened. Where he'd been who Diane believed he was. Where I'd been wrong. But I also felt something else. Underneath all of it, quiet and solid, something like the feeling you get when you've done a job properly. When you built something carefully and found out, when it was tested, that it held. The business held. The properties held. What I'd spent 37 years building was still there, intact, structured to last past me and past whatever any one person decided to do with it. Diane was hurting, but she was okay. She was more than okay. She was more than okay. She was, in her words, finally able to think clearly for the first time in 4 years. She came to Sunday dinner a few weeks after the divorce was finalized. She brought a bottle of Ontario Pinot Noir, which she knows I like. We sat at the same kitchen table I've had since 1994 in the same house I've been in for 30 years. And we ate and we talked about her job and my knees and the winter that was coming. At one point she said, I'm sorry you had to deal with that. I'm sorry I didn't see it. I told her that seeing clearly from inside something is harder than people give credit for. That her mother hadn't always seen things clearly when she was in them either. That I hadn't either plenty of times when it mattered. She looked at me like she was about to say something, then didn't. Then she said, he really thought you were losing your grip. I took a sip of the wine. I know. She almost smiled. Were you ever worried he might be right? I thought about that honestly. 63 years old, 2 bad knees, a company that had been my whole adult life, a wife 8 years in the ground, a daughter who deserved better. Was I worried? Not for a single minute, I said. And the strange thing is, that was true. There's a version of this story where I blow everything up the night I heard him. Where I walk into that sunroom, put my hand on his shoulder, and make sure he understands exactly what kind of man he's dealing with. I've thought about that version. Part of me still finds it satisfying to imagine, but that's not what I did. And I think, at 63, I finally understand why. Owen wasn't undone by my anger. He was undone by his own character. And by the fact that I had spent 4 years, without knowing I needed to, building something he couldn't touch. The business held because I had built it carefully. The properties held because I had structured them honestly. Diane came through it because she had, despite everything, the kind of integrity that lets a person look at a hard truth and not look away from it. None of that happened because of the night I heard him on the phone. All of it happened long before. That's the thing I keep coming back to. The consequences of how a person lives don't arrive all at once. They accumulate quietly, the way interest does on both sides of the ledger. Owen had been making small withdrawals from his character for years before I ever heard that call. Every calculated smile, every question designed to extract information rather than build understanding, every moment he treated Diane's love as a resource rather than a gift. Those were the choices that ultimately undid him. Not me. Not a confrontation. His own record paid out. And on my side of it, 37 years of getting up early and doing the work honestly and keeping my word even when it was inconvenient, that didn't just build a company. It built the conditions under which I could protect my daughter without destroying her in the process. I had the presence of mind to wait because patience was something I had practiced my whole adult life. I had the sense to call Ted and restructure things properly because I had spent decades learning to think before I acted. I had Fran to talk to because I had invested in that relationship for years without ever expecting to need it this way. None of it was luck. It was the accumulated result of 1,000 small decisions made with some degree of decency and clear-headedness, long before they mattered. Diane asked me once after the divorce was final whether I was angry. I had to think about that honestly. There was something there, but it wasn't quite anger. It was more like the feeling you get when you've done a careful job and found that it held under pressure. A kind of quiet satisfaction that has nothing to do with winning and everything to do with having been ready. I think about the men and women I've known who built things that lasted. A business, a family, a reputation, a life. Not one of them did it through cleverness alone, or toughness alone, or good intentions alone. The ones who lasted did it because they kept all three in some kind of balance. The decency to do right by the people around them, the clear-sightedness to understand what was actually happening, and the steadiness to keep going when things were hard or uncertain or slow. Owen had a version of the third one. He was patient. He was persistent. But he'd let the first two go somewhere along the way, and without them, persistence is just a longer route to the same ruin. Diane is okay. Better than okay, honestly. She called last week just to talk, which she never used to do when she was with him. I realize now she was managing two lives and didn't have room for much else. We're having dinner Sunday. She's bringing wine. I'll be 64 in the spring. My knees still hurt. The business is running well under the new structure, and I go in 3 days a week because I want to, not because I have to. It's a good place to be. I'm not sure I'd change any of it. Not even the night in the hallway, coffee going cold, the string lights visible through the kitchen window. Even that, I think, was something I needed to know.